Imagine a nation called Edo, which is basically just ancient Tokyo. Similar to real life Japan prior to the 1860s, Edo was once an isolated nation with its own unique set of cultures until the Amanto aliens forced open its border. As a result, the circumstances established an environment of political instability, which in turn breeds several radical groups with different ideals on how Edo should move forward as a nation. There's the Joey Shishi, whose goal is to
Make
Edo
great again.
by overthrowing the current government. They believe that all the Amanto should be sent back to their home planet. Then, there's the special police force called the Shinsengumi, whose main task is to protect all government officials and Amanto ambassadors. They believe that law and order must be upheld at all costs, even if it means coping with the abuse and discrimination that results from an unjust system. And of course, there's the Yorozuya, led by our main protagonist, Gintoki Sakata. Together with Shinpachi and Kagura, they take up an assortment of requests in exchange for money. The whole show is basically Gintoki vlogging his attempt at trying to live a peaceful life in a nation that has succumbed to foreign power. In a nutshell, experiencing Gintama is a pilgrimage. A pilgrimage to test your perseverance and train your suspension of disbelief. I came into Gintama to get a laugh or two, but for some reason, I initially wasn't really drawn to its comedy, which I find a bit strange. Now, of course, when speaking of comedy, there's always the inevitable can of worms of its subjective nature and whatnot, but I based my expectations on past shows that were allegedly similar to it. If I were to describe my sense of humor, I would say it's or in other words, toilet humor. Previously, I found shows such as Prison School, Grand Blue, and Golden Boy to be something right up my alley, so I reckoned that Gintama would be something similar. I mean, its title is a wordplay on Gintama, which literally translates to golden ball, referring to the male testicle. And although I was initially let down by my own expectations, with time, it does slowly deliver the toilet humor I so desire. But with that said, Gintama's comedy is so much more than just its toilet humor. Even if you have the funniest material to share, if you don't convey it well, then it just wouldn't be funny. Conviction is paramount in delivery, and Gintama is full of it, constantly throwing out punchlines over punchlines over punchlines. If you blindly throw a dart to a target enough times, eventually one of them would end up on target. Likewise, if you constantly regroup and rehash different comedic materials, eventually one of them would stick with the viewer. The show has this knack for introducing a single idea and just continually builds upon it until it reaches an absurd enough proportion. To top it all off, it sprinkles in a bit of wisdom for the cherry on top. There's this one episode where the show starts off by introducing us to a character who has a prison warden fetish. But at the end of the arc, the narrative finds its way exploring the morality of keeping up a false reality in the name of hope. Another pillar for Gintama's comedy is its excellent use of the gap moe concept. As Urban Dictionary defines, Gap moe is when a character does something completely contradictory to what their usual habits / personality / character / appearance dictates. Take Zura, for example. He's usually depicted as this stoic character with an unwavering ideal of what his nation should strive for. But underneath all of that, he's also presented to be someone who fawns over cute and cuddly things, especially his pet Elizabeth. The discord between these two seemingly incongruent traits adds a layer of complexity to the character, and you can observe this duality for almost every single notable side character. This bleeds into the show itself. On the surface, Gintama is a comedy anime, but there are instances where the show throws a curveball and hits you with gut-wrenching visceral arcs that can make you feel things in places you did not know you have. A sucker punchline, if you will. The show really does well in capitalizing on the viewer's brief spell of confusion, and tells them this compelling narrative that I would say even eclipses other traditional shonen. With all that said, I can only gloss over the daunting barriers for entry for so long. And frankly, there are several discouraging ones. But as I mentioned before, experiencing Gintama is a pilgrimage to train your perseverance. Just by virtue of its sheer length, time investment already becomes a salient factor for most. And similar to financial investment, you'd be less inclined to put all your chips on something that has unfavorable returns. Unless you follow r/Wall Street Bets for financial advice. And as such, first impression becomes a critical determinant when trying to gauge how much tendies you're going to make. And honestly, Gintama really doesn't give off a strong first impression. Like most other shonen shows, Gintama starts off by introducing us to its colorful side characters. In One Piece, Luffy faces Axe Hand Morgan to recruit Zoro, then fights off Captain Kuro to recruit Usopp, so on and so forth. And similar to it, the side characters of Gintama are introduced through their own personal story arcs. But unlike One Piece, where you have an idea of what Luffy's end goal is, which is to be Pirate King, Gintoki really doesn't have any grand ambitions like that. There's no overarching plot point set up for a big portion of its introduction. This makes the initial encounters with the side characters feel like a simple mishap rather than a stepping stone to an end goal, which makes it harder for the viewer to be invested in the show. Now, I'm not saying that all shows need to have a huge overarching narrative, but then the show needs to provide other hooks that its viewers can latch onto, and Gintama just simply wasn't providing it until much later on in the series. I mean, the main antagonist was only introduced in the 17th episode, which is longer than most seasonal anime in recent times. Ultimately, it just makes the introduction of the side characters, ergo first dozen of episodes, forgettable. Such a shame, really, because the side characters of Gintama are a huge part of what makes Gintama's world feel so alive in the later parts of the show. Now, a logical remedy for this is perhaps, well, why not skip the first few episodes and start from? In retrospect, I would recommend against that. This is because the first few episodes really do well in drilling us the quirks of each individual side character, slowly acquainting us with the cast and establishing the foundation of its world building. Take Prince Hata, for example. His shtick is that he's an avid exotic animal collector, dumb as dirt, and often gets bullied by those surrounding him. And truthfully, I initially wasn't fond of him as a character, but with time, I gradually warmed up to him. Not because he received some form of character development or anything,
Oh, but you love me.
but because I got trained like a Pavlovian dog to expect an oncoming absurd scene whenever this theme is played. And I'd say I'd make a good dog. Oh god, wait, cut that out of script. While the show does take its sweet time to deliver, a significant element of Gintama's comedy is making references to past events that occurred in earlier episodes. In that regard, the show really does well in rewarding the viewers for sticking through. There's a sense of continuity for most of the running gags. To give an example, in episode 16, Kagura met Hasegawa in a park, and after seeing how repulsive being a jobless middle-aged man is, she decided to give him the nickname
まだお
which originally stood for,
まるでダメなおっさん
and ever since then, Hasegawa is referred to as
まだお
まだおだね。まだおだよ。
まだおだね。
ってまだおですよ
まだおだ。
まだおじゃねえか。
A more subtle example of this is in episode 43, when Kagura insisted on wearing a bright red ninja costume to save Elizabeth. Ever since then, Zura started calling Kagura
リーダー。リーダー。リーダーに。お、リーダー。リーダー
because red costumes are typically worn by the group leaders in Sentai shows. Throughout the entirety of the show, you can pick out a lot of these running gags, be it subtle or explicit. Unfortunately, this reliance on references acts as a sort of double-edged sword. In order to perceive references, the viewers are required to have the proper context. Without it, it would just feel like an out-of-place line. And Gintama heavily references Japanese pop culture, which is frankly obscure for most non-Japanese people. Not to mention that a lot of its witty wordplays are simply lost in translation. It's like reading the English translation for Faust. You'd probably still get something out of it, but you just can't help but be aware of the things you're probably missing out on. In Gintama's case, there were a lot of references that I just simply couldn't comprehend because of a lack of cultural context, prior information, and just knowledge in general. I just can't help but feel that I'm not enjoying it to its full potential at times. But with that said, the jokes that I did get really leaves a big impression on me. Now, if you can overcome all these obstacles, there is a treat for you to behold. From my own personal experience, I started Gintama because I was particularly looking for funny anime to unwind at the end of every day, and Gintama seemed to fit the bill. For one, it's a long-running show, so I have a lot of episodes to chew through. Secondly, story arcs are mostly episodic in nature, so I can consume it at my own pace. And finally, it's regarded to be funny, so I can relax and forget the dread of living for a brief moment. It seemed to perfectly match what I needed at the time, but a few episodes in, it seemed as though it just wasn't meant to be. I just couldn't get into it. But after putting in a certain amount of time towards the show, I just couldn't help but fall under the mindset of hodl on and diamond hands, which loosely translates to, I've put in so much hours watching the show. It must be because I liked it. Right? You know, the quintessential causal flaw. But regardless of the reasoning, it nevertheless fueled the desire within me to see it through till the end, and I'm glad to stick around for the tendies. So, if your taste in humor is similar to mine, you have the time to spare, and you have the fortitude to persevere, go and make a pilgrimage to experience Gintama. And perhaps you'll enjoy it as much as I did. Folks, thank you all for listening, and see you next time.